On a cold New Year's Eve, a lonely tech millionaire sits quietly on a park bench, haunted by memories of the love he lost. He expects silence, but instead, a barefoot little girl approaches and offers him something unexpected: a smile and a chance to meet her mother. What begins as a simple gesture unravels into a story of heartbreak, quiet resilience, rediscovered dreams, and a love neither of them saw coming. From quiet conversations over hot cocoa, to a princess dress in a store window, to the warm glow of a second chance, this is not just a story of giving, but of being seen, believed in, and truly loved. As you lie back tonight, maybe turn off the lights, let the fan hum gently, and let your mind settle. Because this isn't just a bedtime story, it's a journey of healing. If you had to rate the warmth of this story from 0 to 10, what would it be? Drop a number when it's over. But fair warning, your heart might whisper 11. Ready? Let's begin. The city was celebrating as if trying to outshine its heartbeat. Fireworks scattered color across the sky, laughter echoed through the wide avenues, and couples huddled close on benches, under scarves and promises. Central Park, wrapped in a tinsel of white lights and falling snow, pulsed with life. But amidst all of it, near a frozen lake where skaters carved joy into ice, one man sat entirely still. His coat was designer, but it slumped at the shoulders. His eyes followed no one, and his breath fogged and faded fast. Julian Carter, the man tech magazines called the Golden Genius, was spending New Year's Eve exactly where he didn't want to be, anywhere at all. Grief clung to him like the cold, silent, and sharp. And for the third year in a row, he told himself he preferred it this way, alone. No noise, no false cheer. His watch ticked toward midnight, but time meant little now. It had stopped meaning much the day Rachel died. Her name still hurt when he thought about it, still tasted like unfinished prayers. Everyone had told him healing would come with time. They were wrong. What came was emptiness dressed as routine, success layered over the loss. And so here he was, tucked into the shadows of Central Park, hidden beneath a halo of lamplight, trying to disappear while the world celebrated its beginnings. He might have stayed that way until the new year crept past unnoticed, if not for a soft voice that rose through the cold. "You look sad, mister. Want to meet my mommy?" He blinked. The voice didn't belong in this moment, didn't belong in his world. He looked down, startled. And there she was, a little girl, maybe 3 years old, standing beside his bench. Her feet were bare but layered in mismatched socks. Her knit cap sagged over one ear, and her cheeks were apple red from the cold. In one hand, she held a crumpled piece of bread like treasure. But what struck him most were her eyes, bright, curious, fearless. "You do look sad," she added, tilting her head like a question mark. "Mommy says sad people sometimes just need someone to smile at them." Julian opened his mouth, but found no words. The absurdity of it, the timing, the girl, the moment, pressed at his chest, not uncomfortably, but like the first crack of light beneath a locked door. "Where's your mother?" he finally asked. She pointed with her bread hand, scattering crumbs. "There," she said. "She's finding food. She always lets me wait here where it's pretty." Julian followed the direction of her finger and spotted a figure hunched near a trash bin, sifting through discarded takeout boxes with a methodical grace that was oddly dignified. The woman moved slowly, carefully, as though she were not scavenging but selecting. Her long blonde hair fell in loose waves, catching the lamplight like silk. Even from this distance, she looked graceful, not desperate, not broken, just tired. "She's really pretty," the girl added cheerfully, as if reading his thoughts. "But she gets hungry a lot. We both do." Julian's throat tightened. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lila," she replied. "Are you supposed to talk to strangers, Lila?" "No," she admitted, then shrugged. But you looked like you needed a friend. I know that feeling. I don't have friends either. He hesitated. Logic told him to smile politely and send her back. But logic had never been his strong suit when it came to the unexpected. He stood, slowly, as if waking from a trance. I'm Julian, he said, extending his hand. Her fingers were ice. She took his without fear, her smile blooming like a secret. Nice to meet you, Julian, she chirped. Then she tugged him gently, leading him away from his solitude and towards something else, something that felt like movement. As they walked past other parkgoers, some glanced curiously, but no one stopped them. The lights above blinked lazily, softening the snow into silver mist. Julian had never walked slower in his life, nor with such a strange purpose. Each step felt like a question he didn't know he'd been asking. Lila skipped beside him, chattering occasionally, but mostly humming a tune that had no melody. When they neared the trash bin, the woman looked up and froze. Her posture straightened immediately, eyes narrowing with a mother's alertness. She dropped the container she'd been examining and moved swiftly toward them. Lila, she called, voice taut. What did I say about wandering off? Her tone was sharp, but not angry, worried, protective. She stopped short when she saw Julian beside her daughter, her gaze flicking to their clasped hands. I'm so sorry if she bothered you, she said, pulling Lila gently behind her. She's friendly. I've told her not to speak to people she doesn't know. Julian raised his hands in calm defense. She didn't bother me at all, he said. She might have rescued me. The woman frowned, confused. Lila beamed. Told you, she whispered to her mom. He was super sad. The woman sighed softly, her eyes scanning Julian again. His coat, his watch, his posture, noticing everything. She has a big heart, she murmured. So I see, Julian replied, and for the first time in months he smiled. He didn't know what made him say it, whether it was instinct or desperation, but the words came before he could second-guess them. Would you both let me buy you something warm to eat? He asked. There's a cart just over there. No expectations. Just kindness. The woman hesitated. Her lips parted, eyes flickering. Pride warred with practicality. But Lila's eyes lit up instantly. Can I get hot chocolate? She asked. Julian chuckled. Absolutely. The woman finally nodded once, slowly, like a tree bending to the wind. Okay, she said. Just something small. They walked together toward the cart, the snow crunching softly beneath them. And though he didn't realize it yet that moment, 3 figures moving through the park's soft glow, a mother, her child, and a man with a grieving heart, would become the first step in a story far bigger than kindness, and far deeper than coincidence. It would become the night he stopped being alone. The steam rose gently from the cart, mingling with the cold air in swirling patterns as Julian handed over a few bills and waited for the cups to fill. Behind him, Lila danced in place, the excitement in her small frame completely unaffected by the winter chill. The woman, her mother, stood nearby, arms crossed tightly, not from the cold, he sensed, but from habit. She wasn't used to standing still. He turned and offered her one of the 2 steaming cups. Her fingers hovered before she took it, as if holding back a question that wouldn't come. It's just hot chocolate, he said softly. No expectations, no strings. She accepted the drink with a silent nod, not quite meeting his eyes. They stood there, the 3 of them, tucked beside the coffee cart like a forgotten painting in a quiet corner of the city. Lila was the only one who moved freely, sipping with both hands and sighing dramatically after each gulp. Her mother, however, was different. There was a stillness about her, not of peace but of practiced control. Julian studied her, not in the way a man looks at a woman, but in the way a quiet mind seeks understanding. She was beautiful, yes, but not in the fragile, polished way people expect. Her beauty was tempered, like steel, refined by hardship and sharpened by necessity. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't begged. She simply existed with a dignity most people couldn't wear if they tried. He cleared his throat, unsure how to begin. "Do you have a name?" he asked, his voice careful. The woman looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Ulissa," she replied after a pause. "Ulissa Grace." Julian gave a small nod, storing the name like it meant more than he understood. "I'm Julian," he offered, though she probably knew that already. His face had been on more covers than he cared to remember, but she didn't blink at the name, didn't flinch or gush or ask if he was that Julian. Instead, she just said, "Thank you for the drink." Her tone was polite but closed, the way someone speaks when they're used to being disappointed. They moved to a nearby bench, one not yet claimed by holiday crowds, and sat, the three of them close enough for warmth, but distant in everything else. Lila nestled between them, legs swinging, still clutching her cocoa like it was spun gold. Julian glanced at Ulissa again. "How long have you two been—" He trailed off, unwilling to finish the sentence. Ulissa understood anyway. "Since Lila was born," she said, the words flat but not bitter. 3 years. Her hand reached instinctively to brush a strand of hair from Lila's forehead, a motion so fluid it looked like breathing. "We move around, shelters, corners, benches, wherever we can land for the night." Julian didn't respond immediately. He was used to problems with spreadsheets, investors, with deadlines. Not this. Not the soft resilience of a woman holding the world together with threadbare mittens and a child's trust. "Were you working before?" he asked. Ulissa gave a faint, humorless smile. "I was studying," she said. "Nursing, top of my class." The pride in her voice was barely audible, buried beneath layers of fatigue. "Then I got pregnant, and the father, well, he vanished before I started a show. No support, no family that wanted to help. You'd be surprised how fast your life can dissolve when one thing goes wrong." Lila, oblivious to the weight of her mother's words, was humming a song under her breath, her eyes chasing the twinkle lights above. "I tried to hang on," Ulissa continued, "but tuition doesn't wait. Neither does rent, or prenatal appointments. Eventually it was food or school. I chose food, and here we are." Her voice didn't tremble, not even once. She wasn't telling him this for sympathy. She was telling him because she was done pretending her story was something else. "I'm sorry," Julian said, though it felt weak and insufficient. Ulissa shrugged. "Don't be. I have Lila. That's more than a lot of people have." At that, the little girl looked up and smiled as if on cue, her cheeks dusted with cocoa. "Mommy makes everything okay," she said proudly. Julian felt a sharp twist in his chest, something between guilt and awe. He had built a company, an empire, and yet he'd never seen a structure so stable as this. This bond between mother and child, forged in hardship and bound by something fiercer than survival. He looked back at Ulissa. "You're strong," he said, not because it sounded good, but because it was true. She gave him a long look, then as if deciding whether or not to believe him. Finally, she said, "Strong isn't a choice. It's just what's left when everything else is gone." The words hit harder than he expected. Julian had always thought strength came from drive, ambition, and strategy. But hers was carved out of necessity, stitched from broken hours and sleepless nights. Silence fell again, but this time it was softer, comfortable even, the kind of quiet that follows truth. The snow had started falling again, light and slow, brushing their coats in a delicate rhythm. Julian glanced at the little girl now, finishing her drink, her eyes already beginning to droop. He didn't want to say goodnight. Not yet. Not after this. And so he said something impulsive, something he hadn't said to anyone in years. "There's a place nearby," he began, his voice steady. "A quiet little boutique. They stay open late tonight for the holiday. Maybe we could—" He hesitated, then added, "Let her pick out something warm. Just this once." Ulysses' expression shifted, not to anger or offense, but to hesitation. Pride flared for a moment, clashing with gratitude. She opened her mouth to speak, to protest, but Lila looked up at her with such wide, hopeful eyes that she didn't finish the sentence. And just like that, the door to something began to creak open. Not wide, not all at once, but enough to let the light in. Enough to take one step forward. Enough to begin. The boutique stood like a beacon at the corner of the block, its frosted windows glowing softly beneath a golden street lamp. Inside, warm light spilled across rows of neatly hung children's clothes and modest women's dresses, each piece seemingly untouched by the chaos of the world outside. Julian paused just before the door, glancing sideways at Ulysses, whose posture had gone rigid again. She wasn't holding Lila's hand anymore. The little girl was already pressed to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared in wonder at a pink satin dress trimmed with tiny faux gems. But Ulysses didn't look at the display. She looked at the threshold as though stepping inside meant crossing something she wasn't sure she could return from. Julian didn't say anything. He simply opened the door and waited. The bell above the entrance chimed gently, and a wave of warm air swept out to greet them. Lila was the first to move, pulled by the sheer magic of the place. Ulysses followed a second later, her steps careful, like each one might trigger an alarm. The clerk behind the counter glanced up, her smile polite, but her eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of Ulysses' threadbare coat and worn boots. Julian felt the shift in the room, the unspoken judgment that always lingered in places like this. And so he moved closer, subtly positioning himself at Ulysses' side, not as a rescuer, but as a shield. Lila made a beeline for the princess dress, her small hands lifting it with reverence, the way some children might hold a holy relic. "It's the most beautiful dress I've ever seen," she whispered, half to herself. Ulysses stepped forward, gently placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Sweetheart, that's not for us," she said softly, but Lila's eyes didn't move. Julian knelt beside her, his voice quiet but firm. "Sometimes," he said, "it's not about what we need. It's about feeling special, even just once." Ulysses didn't speak, but her gaze drifted to a simpler dress hanging to the side. Cream-colored, soft knit, elegant in its understatement. She stared at it for a long moment, her hand twitching as though pulled toward it, despite herself. "You should try it on," Julian said, not looking at her. "It looks like it's been waiting for someone brave enough to wear it." Ulysses turned sharply, something unreadable flashing across her face. "I don't need charity," she said, and there was steel in her tone. Not anger, but something close to pain. "This isn't charity," Julian replied evenly. "This is acknowledgement." The words hung between them, heavy and honest. After a pause, she reached for the hanger. The dress felt light in her hands, too soft for someone used to rough fabric and colder nights. The dressing room was small, lit by a single bulb, and the mirror had a crack running across the corner. Still, Ulysses stared at her reflection like it belonged to someone else. Her hands smoothed the dress against her body, unsure. The fabric hugged her gently, hinting at the woman she once was, or maybe still was beneath all the layers of survival. She emerged slowly, hesitant, and for a heartbeat, Julian forgot how to speak. She looked not transformed but uncovered, like someone stepping out from behind years of rain. Lila clapped, her laughter ringing like bells. "You look like a queen, Mommy," she said. Ulysses' face softened, just a little. After they left the boutique, the city had changed. Snow fell slower now, or maybe the world had just quieted. They walked back through Central Park, not as strangers, but as something closer. The dress was packed neatly in a small paper bag. Lila's hand clutched tightly in her mother's. Julian walked beside them, his own hands deep in his pockets, trying to anchor himself to this moment that somehow felt more real than anything he'd known in months. He wanted to ask questions, to know more about Ulyssa, about the path that brought her here. But something about the way she carried herself told him to wait. They reached the same bench they'd left earlier, and this time, it welcomed them. Lila climbed onto it immediately, unwrapping a granola bar she'd been saving like a treasure. Ulyssa sat down more slowly, the dress bag resting beside her, like something too fragile to let go. Julian remained standing for a moment, watching the way she looked at her daughter. "You said you were in school," he said finally, his voice gentle. "Nursing, right?" Ulyssa nodded without turning. "I was in my 3rd year. Pediatrics, I always loved kids. It made sense back then." Her eyes flicked toward Lila. "Still does." "What happened?" he asked. Not pushing, just opening the door. She took a breath, slow and deep, as though reaching for a memory that had been buried under too many cold nights. "I found out I was pregnant after midterms," she said. "The father left before I even started showing. My family, well, they had their problems. I stayed quiet, hoping I could figure it out on my own." Her voice didn't break, but it thinned at the edges. "I worked 2 jobs, slept maybe 4 hours a night, tried to keep up with class. But tuition doesn't care about real life, neither do landlords." Julian sat beside her, not too close, letting the silence stretch where it needed to. "You didn't drop out," he said, more statement than a question. Ulyssa shook her head. "I held on as long as I could, until the rent went unpaid, the utility bill stacked up, and my pregnancy got complicated. After that, no more classes, no more apartments, just this." She gestured at the park, the snow, the bench. "But I had her," she added quietly. "And that was always enough." He didn't speak for a while because anything he said felt too small. He'd spent fortunes on launches, salaries, and retreats, all meant to spark inspiration, loyalty, or growth. But here sat a woman who had built an entire universe around a child, with nothing but grit and love. And somehow, she was still standing. Ulyssa turned her head, finally meeting his eyes. "Why are you here, Julian?" she asked, not with suspicion, but with the calm curiosity of someone who had seen too much to be surprised. He hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because you reminded me what strength looks like, and because I didn't want to be alone when the year changed." Lila had dozed off by then, curled into her mother's side, her tiny fingers clutching the edge of the boutique bag. Ulyssa looked down at her, then back at him. "No one wants to be alone," she said. "Some of us just got better at pretending." And in that quiet moment, beneath the fading lights of the park and the muffled sounds of celebration in the distance, Julian realized something. He hadn't come looking for anything tonight, but maybe, just maybe, something had found him anyway. The night deepened around them, pressing in with the kind of cold that clung to skin and seeped into bone. Central Park had thinned, the noise of celebration shifting farther away as families returned to their homes and lovers retreated into the warmth of taxis and townhouses. Only the occasional firework echoed in the distance now, a fading heartbeat of the year slipping into memory. On the bench beneath the swaying glow of a string-lit tree, Julian remained still, his breath forming soft clouds that disappeared into the night. Beside him, Ulissa sat with Lila's sleeping head cradled in her lap, her fingers moving gently through golden curls, as if to smooth away the weight of the day. Neither spoke. There was no need. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, stretched between them like a fragile thread, holding something unnamed. The small paper bag with addresses sat beside Ulissa's leg, forgotten for the moment. Julian glanced at her hands as they moved, noting the chipped nails, the raw knuckles, and the care in every motion. She wasn't simply brushing her hair. She was preserving something, protecting the small world she had left. "She falls asleep fast," he said eventually, his voice a low murmur. "Only when she feels safe," Ulissa replied, her eyes not lifting from her daughter. "Most nights, that takes a while." A gust of wind brushed past them, rattling the branches above. Ulissa pulled a tattered book from her bag, its corners bent, its spine held together with tape. She didn't explain. She opened it without hesitation and began to speak, not reading, but weaving. "Once upon a time," she began softly, "in a city made of silver towers and shadows, there lived a little princess who had no shoes but the brightest heart you'd ever see." Her voice didn't waver, though Julian could feel the weight behind every word. "And one snowy night, while the whole city slept, she met a man with a frozen heart, sitting all alone beneath a glowing tree." Julian didn't move, but something inside him cracked, slow and silent. Ulissa continued, her voice melodic, steady. The princess smiled at him, not because she had to, but because she believed no heart should stay frozen forever. And slowly, without even knowing it, the man's heart began to thaw. He didn't speak, couldn't. His jaw clenched slightly, but he kept his gaze on the snow-covered path ahead. The story wasn't just a story. It was a mirror, polished smooth by sorrow, held up in her hands for him to see himself clearly for the first time in years. "She doesn't know how hard the world is," Ulissa said, her voice breaking gently into reality. "And I don't want her to. Not yet. So I make it magical while I still can." She closed the book with one hand, the other still resting on Lila's back. "That's how she sleeps. That's how I keep the dark from creeping in." Julian turned to her then, really turned, and looked at her not as a woman on a bench in the park, not as someone he'd stumbled upon by chance, but as someone who carried more weight in her silence than he had ever dared face in his own. "She doesn't feel poor," Ulissa added after a beat, her tone resolute. "Not when we're together." Julian swallowed hard, a lump rising in his throat with painful urgency. He had known wealth in every form, money, power, success. But this quiet resilience, this tender strength wrapped in a mother's hands, it made him feel small in the best, most humbling way. "I haven't cried since Rachel's funeral," he admitted suddenly, his voice thin, raw. "Not once. I thought if I started, I wouldn't be able to stop." Ulissa didn't respond immediately, and when she did, it was with a softness that almost unraveled him. "You couldn't save her," she said, not as comfort, but as truth. "But she knew she was loved. That's everything." Julian turned his face away, but not before a single tear escaped, trailing down his cheek and disappearing into the collar of his coat. He wiped it quickly, almost ashamed, but the weight of her words stayed lodged in his chest, pressing against all the years he'd buried his grief beneath meetings, headlines, and empty penthouses. "Do you think that's enough?" he asked, his voice barely above the wind. "That love alone is enough." Ulissa looked down at her daughter, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "Every night, I wonder if I'm doing enough. If sleeping on benches and eating scraps is going to damage her in ways I can't see yet. But then, she looks at me like I'm her whole world, and I realize it's the only thing that's never failed her." She met his gaze again, unwavering. Love is the only thing they can't take from us. Another tear escaped him, then another. He let them fall. For the first time in years, he didn't try to fight them, didn't lock them away, or transform them into productivity or profit. He just felt them. And Yulissa didn't move, didn't offer false comfort or awkward gestures. Instead, she shifted slightly and leaned into him, her shoulder resting lightly against his. She said nothing more. And it was enough. It was more than enough. Around them, the park continued to slumber, wrapped in winter and whispered dreams. In the distance, the final bursts of fireworks shimmered like memories, fading into the dark sky. But here, on a forgotten bench, a man who had lost everything was finding something he didn't know he needed. A story told in quiet words, a hand that didn't flinch, and a child's warmth asleep beside him. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was the first breath of something new, something real. And as the snow began to fall again, he closed his eyes, not to forget but to remember, finally, without fear. The final seconds of the year were winding down, but the city felt suspended in time, as though holding its breath. The streets near Central Park had begun to quiet, and Julian walked beside Yulissa and Lila, who had woken from her nap with renewed energy and questions about the fireworks. She skipped between them, one hand in her mother's, the other occasionally reaching out to touch a snow-dusted bush or point at glowing windows high above. Julian watched her quietly, taking in the way her joy pulsed in bursts, untamed, innocent, pure. Yulissa said little, but her presence beside him felt different now. It wasn't guarded like before, and though she wasn't leaning into him as she had on the bench, the space between them no longer felt like a divide. They stopped at the edge of Fifth Avenue, where most of the shops had closed early, their windows still aglow with meticulously arranged holiday displays. It was there, in the center of one sparkling boutique window, that Lila froze. Her breath fogged the glass as she stared at the mannequin. Tall, regal, clothed in a shimmering pink gown with puffed sleeves, lace trim, and tiny rhinestones that caught the light like stars. "It's the most beautiful dress I've ever seen," she whispered, her voice hushed with reverence. Yulissa gently tugged her hand, but Lila stood firm, unwilling to move. "Come on, sweetheart," her mother said, her tone soft but final. "That's not for us." But Julian was already looking at the display, not at the dress, but at the child who had worn socks over bare feet and still offered a stranger warmth. "What do you think, Princess?" he asked, kneeling beside her. Lila didn't look away from the gown. "It looks like it's made for a real princess," she said, her voice trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from the ache of knowing something so beautiful would never belong to her. Yulissa's voice came sharper now, though still quiet. "She doesn't need it. We're okay." Julian stared his eyes on Yulissa now. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "it's not about need. Sometimes it's about letting someone feel seen, just once." He shifted his gaze to another dress in the corner of the window. It was simpler, cream-colored, made of soft wool and fine stitching. It had no gems, no lace, but it radiated warmth and quiet elegance. "That one," he said gently, "looks like it's waiting for someone brave for far too long." Yulissa followed his eyes, and for a moment, her expression faltered. Her lips parted as if to object, but no words came. She looked at Lila, then at her reflection in the darkened glass, blurry, tired but still standing. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, caught between instinct and longing. Inside the boutique, the air was scented with lavender and polished wood. The clerk raised a brow as they entered, her gaze flicking to Yulissa's fraying coat, then settling quickly on Julian. Recognition flickered, and her demeanor shifted. She didn't speak, just offered a small nod and stepped aside. Leela made a beeline for the pink gown, giggling as Julian lifted it off the rack and held it up to her. It swallowed her tiny frame, but her joy filled the entire space. Yulissa walked more slowly, her steps unsure, her fingers grazing the fabric of the cream dress, like it might vanish if she held on too tightly. Julian didn't interfere. He watched. He waited. When she finally stepped into the fitting room, the curtain half closed behind her, he sat on the narrow bench outside and pretended not to listen to the quiet rustle of fabric, the faint sigh. Minutes later, the curtain slid aside, and Yulissa stepped out. The dress fit her perfectly, not as a transformation, but as a reminder. Her hair framed her face in soft waves, her posture straightened without effort, and though she didn't smile, there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Lila twirled in her gown, spinning so fast that her laughter filled the store like music. Yulissa stood in the mirror's glow, and for a moment, she didn't look like a mother fighting for survival. She looked like a woman reclaiming her place in the world. When they stepped back out onto the street, the first fireworks bloomed above them, crimson and gold across the black sky. Lila gasped, clutching Julian's hand, her pink dress fluttering like a flag. Yulissa looked up, her breath catching as the sky exploded with color. But Julian didn't look at the fireworks. He looked at them, at Yulissa and Lila, standing under the lights, glowing from within. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were visible. They were real. The world might still be cold, but for this moment, wrapped in dresses and silence and wonder, it didn't feel so unkind. People passed around them, eyes turned upward, arms entwined, laughter spilling into the street. But none of it mattered, because the most beautiful sight Julian saw that night wasn't above. It was beside him. He realized then that this wasn't just about kindness. It wasn't about guilt or fixing something broken. It was about witnessing someone's worth and giving them the space to feel it for themselves. As the clock struck midnight and the fireworks reached their crescendo, Lila yelled, "Happy New Year!" with her arms thrown high, confetti from a torn napkin fluttering from her pockets. Yulissa turned to Julian, her eyes reflecting the sky. "Thank you," she said simply. He shook his head. "Don't thank me," he murmured. "Just keep shining." And at that moment, under the fractured light of 1,000 sparks, something shifted, not just in the air, but in all three of them. The year had changed, but so had they. They didn't know what came next, but they weren't afraid to find out. The night after the fireworks, the city exhaled. The streets were quieter, littered with party hats and melted snow, while the echoes of celebration faded into the cold wind. Julian hadn't slept much. He kept replaying the image of Yulissa in the cream-colored dress and Lila spinning under the exploding sky. It haunted him, not in sorrow, but in a way that made him restless, alive. Something had shifted. Something inside him refused to return to silence, to the polished solitude of penthouses and boardrooms. He didn't want the night to be a memory. He wanted it to be a beginning. By noon, he stood in the lobby of a modest extended-stay hotel tucked away in a quiet part of the city, a place clean and warm, but unassuming. Just enough dignity without a trace of luxury. He paid for a month up front and left a room key at the front desk with a note. No strings, just rest. Why? Then he drove to the park, where they had agreed to meet. Yulissa was waiting by the same bench, Lila bundled in her coat, holding the boutique bag as if it were a treasure. Yulissa looked at him cautiously, her face unreadable. He said nothing, just held out the key. She stared at it for a long time, then slowly took it, her fingers brushing his. "Why?" she asked. He shrugged. "Because I don't want you freezing again tonight, and because last night shouldn't be the last warm one you remember." She opened her mouth to speak, maybe to object, but instead, she closed it and nodded. No thanks, no dramatics, just quiet acceptance, which somehow meant more than gratitude ever could. The room was small but bright, with a little kitchenette, a clean bathroom, and, most importantly, a bed just for Lila. When the little girl saw it, she squealed with delight and leapt onto the mattress, giggling as she bounced. Yulissa stood at the doorway, frozen, her bag still on her shoulder. It took her a full minute before she stepped inside. "You can stay as long as you need," Julian said, "but I've paid through the end of the month. After that, it's up to you." She nodded again, slower this time. "I don't know what to say," he shook his head. "You don't have to say anything. Just rest tonight." The next morning, he returned with coffee, bagels, and a box of cereal with a cartoon princess on the front. Lila, still in pajamas, danced around the kitchenette with a plastic spoon, pretending to be a fairy. Yulissa looked more rested than he had ever seen her, though her eyes still held caution, as if rest itself were a fragile luxury that might be snatched away. Over breakfast, Julian said casually, "There's a nursing program nearby, evening classes. You said you were in school before." Yulissa looked up sharply. "You looked into it," he nodded. "It's part-time and affordable. I can cover the tuition if you want to finish what you started." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she leaned back, her hands around a chipped coffee mug. "I never stopped wanting it," she admitted. "I just stopped believing it was possible." Julian smiled. "Well, maybe it is now." She looked at him with something new, still guarded, but less rigid. "I won't take a free ride," she said firmly. "If you help me, I work. I pull my weight." He didn't argue. "There's a small office I own a few blocks from the school. Janitorial work. Nights. It's quiet, the staff are decent." She didn't hesitate. "I'll take it." That week, Yulissa enrolled in the nursing program, and just like that, the rhythm of their days began to change. 3 nights a week, she cleaned offices, while Lila sat in a corner with crayons or an old iPod Julian lent her, giggling at cartoons. On weekends, Julian took Lila to the park so Yulissa could study in silence. Sometimes he brought soup, flashcards, sometimes nothing but time. He never hovered, never offered more than she was willing to accept. And that boundary, carefully drawn and fiercely respected, built something far stronger than dependence. It built trust. Each Thursday, they came to his apartment for dinner, not because he asked, but because Lila insisted. The first time, Yulissa had stood awkwardly at the threshold, unsure whether she belonged. But when Lila kicked off her shoes and ran straight to the kitchen, shouting about helping Chef Julian stir the pasta, something in Yulissa eased. They cooked together, ate together. She read her notes aloud while dinner simmered. He quizzed her over dessert. And every week they stayed a little longer. One night, he arrived early. The door to the hotel room was ajar. He knocked, then stepped in quietly. The TV was off. Lila was asleep on the couch, a book spread across her chest. Yulissa sat at the table, highlighter in hand, hunched over a thick binder. A cold cup of tea sat nearby. She didn't even look up. She was focused, steady, exhausted, but radiant in a way he couldn't explain. He didn't speak. He watched her for a full minute and realized something so simple it startled him. She didn't need saving. She needed belief. When she finally looked up and saw him standing there, her face lit up, not with surprise, but something softer. "You're early," she said, brushing hair behind her ear. "I thought I'd help with dinner," he replied, holding up a grocery bag. "Maybe quiz you while we cook," she grinned. "Deal." As they moved around the tiny kitchen, bumping elbows and laughing over spilled flour, Julian felt something loosen inside him, Something that had been frozen, rigid, locked away. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't romantic. It was quiet and real, and alive. From the couch, Lila stirred. "Mommy," she murmured, eyes still closed. "Don't forget my story." Yulissa wiped her hands and knelt beside her daughter, brushing a kiss on her forehead. "I never forget," she whispered. And as Julian watched them, this girl who brought him back to life, and the woman who carried galaxies in her silence, he knew, with sudden certainty, that whatever came next, he didn't want to face it without them. Not because they needed him, but because for the first time in years, he felt needed too. The city was slick with recent rain, and its lights reflected on the pavement like brush strokes on wet glass. Tuesday evenings had a rhythm now. Text messages exchanged, pictures of Lila's doodles sent with hearts in the corners, and sometimes a voice memo from Yulissa reciting dosage conversions or pediatric triage notes. But tonight was different. There was no message, no question, no reply. At first, Julian thought she might have been too tired or caught up in studying, but as the hours dragged by without a word, a quiet worry crept into his chest, unshakable and sharp. By 9, he was in the car, hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary as he drove through dim, quiet streets toward the extended stay hotel. The building loomed ahead, ordinary and still. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time and knocked on the door gently, then harder when there was no answer. A pause. Then the handle turned, and Yulissa appeared, hair pulled back in a messy bun, dark shadows beneath her eyes. Behind her, he heard coughing, small, rhythmic, and weak. "You didn't have to come," she said, her voice low, but not unkind. "You missed class," he replied, already stepping inside. The room was dim, lit only by the soft flicker of a bedside lamp. Lila lay curled on the bed, cheeks flushed, a damp cloth on her forehead. On the table nearby sat a thermometer, a half-finished bottle of children's medicine, flashcards, and an open textbook scrawled with notes. "She started feeling sick last night," she said as she adjusted the blanket over her daughter. "The fever hit this morning. I didn't want to bother you." Julian knelt beside the bed, brushing a gentle hand through Lila's hair. Her skin was warm to the touch, but not burning. "Is she okay?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's just a cold," Yulissa said softly. "I've been watching her fever. It's already coming down." He turned toward the cluttered table, taking in the untouched sandwich, the cold tea, the relentless notes. "You were still studying." She met his eyes then, defensive. "I have an exam on Thursday. I can't afford to fall behind." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned against the edge of the table and looked at her, not just with concern, but with something deeper, something that had been building quietly between them for weeks. "Why do you push yourself so hard?" he asked, not accusingly, but with raw, sincere curiosity. Yulissa's gaze dropped to Lila, her voice nearly a whisper. "Because she believes I can be more. She thinks I can do anything. And if I give up now, I'll be proving the world right instead of her." That was the moment. Not the smile she gave him at dinner, not the laughter over burnt pasta, not even the night on the park bench. This was the moment he knew. He loved her. Not in the way people fall in love with someone beautiful or kind or convenient, but in the way a man falls for the truth, the kind of truth that burns away everything that came before. He loved her because she never asked to be saved, because she was fierce and soft in the same breath, because no matter how much the world took, she never stopped giving. "I brought soup," he said after a breath, lifting the small thermos from his bag and setting it on the table. "It's probably cold by now, but I can heat it up." Yulissa smiled faintly, the kind of smile that said, "I see you," even if she didn't say it out loud. Julian, picked up the flashcards and sat beside her. "Let me help," he said. She hesitated, then nodded. And just like that, the room shifted. They sat shoulder to shoulder at the small table, flipping through terms and symptoms while Lila slept quietly in the background. Julian asked questions. Yulissa answered with a focus that impressed him even more in her exhaustion. Between cards, he stole glances at her, at the stubborn crease in her brow, at the way she tapped her fingers when she was unsure, at the gentle slope of her shoulders, leaning into the task. She didn't just want to pass. She wanted to prove she still had control over her life, and he wanted to help her hold on to that. Eventually, Yulissa leaned back, her head resting against the wall, eyes closed for a moment, longer than a blink. "I used to think love was something that came with comfort," she said quietly, not opening her eyes. "Stability, safety, a house with soft towels and wine glasses that matched." Julian waited, knowing better than to interrupt. "But maybe love is this," she continued. "Showing up, being seen, being handed soup and flashcards in a room that smells like cough syrup and laundry." Julian didn't answer, not with words. He simply reached for her hand, not forcefully, just enough for their fingers to brush and settle. Her hand curled slowly around his, and neither of them moved. In that stillness, there was no grand declaration, no sweeping kiss. Just warmth, shared silence, and the feeling that neither of them had to carry everything alone anymore. The storm outside had passed. The air was calmer, steadier. Lila shifted on the bed, murmuring in her sleep. Yulissa stood and checked on her again, pressing the thermometer to her forehead and whispering something only a mother would say. Julian watched her, heart full, knowing that love wasn't born in one moment, but it revealed itself in them, over and over again, in every quiet act that stitched two lives together. And in that small, dim room, surrounded by books, medicine, and the hum of breath, Julian knew what his heart had decided long before his mind could catch up. He didn't want to walk away from this story. He didn't want to be a chapter in Yulissa's life. He wanted to be there for every page, every sentence, every breath. Not because she needed him, but because finally, he needed her. The winter had softened. Snow no longer came with fury, but with grace, drifting down like feathers across the city's shoulders. A full year had passed since that first night in Central Park, and yet, to Julian, it felt like a blink and a lifetime. The city still shimmered with its artificial lights and manicured wonder, but the things that stirred him now were quieter. The giggle of a child in the hallway, the hum of a washing machine late at night, the whisper of a page turning at the kitchen table while the soup simmered in the background. He no longer chased moments that dazzled. He found himself waiting for the ones that lingered. It was New Year's Eve again, but this time, everything felt different. Julian stood in the doorway of his brownstone, a place that used to echo with silence, and now held the sounds of life. He watched as Yulissa stepped inside first, cheeks pink from the cold, her pale blue nurse's uniform slightly wrinkled after a long shift at the community hospital. The badge on her chest read, Yulissa Grace, RN, and though it was small, it carried with it a mountain of battles won, late-night studying, exhaustion, setbacks, and triumph. He could see it in the way she moved now, steady and rooted, like someone who had stopped waiting for permission to belong. Right behind her came Lila, skipping in a sparkly pink dress they'd picked out together a few days ago. She held a homemade card high in the air, her pride as loud as her laughter. "Look what I made," she beamed, waving the card before she even took her boots off. It was decorated in glitter and swirls, misshapen hearts, and stick figures drawn in crayon. Across the front it read in crooked, bright letters, "Our first real New Year's together." Julian took the card carefully, as though it were made of glass, and knelt beside her. "It's perfect," he said. "Just like you." In the kitchen, Yulissa had already begun unpacking groceries he'd left earlier. Nothing fancy. Pasta, garlic bread, a chocolate cake covered in an almost ridiculous amount of sprinkles that Lila had insisted on decorating herself. Julian watched her from the doorway, his heart tightening, not from fear or sadness, but from a depth he hadn't known he possessed. The house smelled like warmth and flour, like presents. The table was already half set, napkins folded into triangles, candles flickering by the window. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs. Over dinner, the conversation flowed with ease. Leela chattered about her plans for becoming a doctor princess, while Yulissa listened, with that quiet, amused patience Julian had come to adore. Their hands brushed as they passed the salad, and when their eyes met, there was no hesitation, no awkwardness, just understanding. After they cleared the table, Lila curled onto the couch, a blanket pulled to her chin, her eyelids heavy, but unwilling to miss a second of the night. Yulissa lit candles on the windowsill, while Julian stirred hot cocoa on the stove. As the final minutes of the year approached, Julian stood behind Yulissa at the window, watching the snow fall outside. It looked like powdered sugar over the rooftops, soft and clean. He reached for her hand and turned her gently toward him. Her eyes shimmered beneath the candlelight, and in them he saw every moment that had led here. The bench in the park, the soup in the dark, the dresses and flashcards, and midnight tears. "You didn't just save her," he said quietly. "You saved me." Yulissa blinked slowly, then reached for his hand and placed it over her heart. "I think we saved each other." He leaned in, their lips meeting not with urgency, but with reverence, like a promise being made, not just to love, but to stay. From the couch, Lila squealed. "Ew, kissing!" she shouted, before breaking into a fit of giggles. They all laughed, the kind that came from fullness, not perfection, because things weren't perfect. The rent still existed, the world outside still spun, and life still brought its troubles. But in this house, in this moment, there was peace. The TV ticked down the final seconds. 10, 9. Julian pulled Yulissa close on one side, and Lila climbed onto his other knee, wrapping her arms around his neck. 8, 7, 6. The world outside burst into color again, fireworks painting the sky in silver and red, like the year before. Only now, he didn't need to look away. 5, 4, 3. This time, he was ready. 2, 1. "Happy New Year!" Lila shouted, throwing a handful of confetti made from cut-up tissue paper into the air. Yulissa laughed, brushing glitter from her hair. Julian looked at both of them. This woman who had walked through fire and come out kind. This child who had smiled her way into his heart. And he knew that what they had created wasn't built on luck or magic. It wasn't a fairy tale, it didn't need to be. It was built on small moments, on showing up, on choosing each other again and again, even when life made it difficult. As the clock reset and the fireworks echoed into the night, they stayed wrapped in that blanket on the couch, hands intertwined, breaths synced. They had not needed a miracle. They had simply needed time, a place, and each other. And so, in the quiet hush of the new year, with no grand plans or glittering promises, a family began, not with vows or blood, but with love that asked for nothing and gave everything. And that, Julian thought as he kissed Lila's sleepy forehead, was more than enough. Thank you for joining me on this heartfelt journey, a story not of grand gestures, but of quiet strength, second chances, and the kind of love that grows in the simplest moments. If this story moved you, made you reflect, or warmed even a small part of your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to share what touched you most. Every comment and every reflection helps keep these stories alive. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and never stop believing in the quiet magic of everyday love.